If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
It's Professor William Harbaugh from the University of Oregon. Bill's a significant part of his work is the area of neuroeconomics. He is one of a few number of people who have specialized in looking into the area, looking inside people's brain using scanners and so on, and then correlating with the person's experience in the experience of economic outcomes and making decisions. So he is looking for the relationship between the actual relation and then actually and what happens inside the brain. So the other thing that he has been working also is in the area of looking at children, where their economic behavior of really young people in terms of when they get toys or treats or something like this, how they compare with the behavior of adults. So I'm not quite sure if I got it right, but this is another one of his the area that he's very interested in, and I think he's going to be talking about something he would call warm glow altruism, something that distinguishes from pure altruism. I met Bill recently, a few months ago in Zurich. He was in a conference with the Dalai Lama and a whole bunch of scientists from different disciplines, psychology, neuroscientists, and in that conference for the first time we have a number of eminent economists having a very remarkable discussion with a spiritual teacher like the Dalai Lama. So here is Professor Bill Harbaugh.
So thank you, Victor, and thanks for the introduction. So I am an economist, and so my talk is going to be a little more focused on economic questions and hopefully not too depressing. Okay. And hopefully I can get this thing started here. Definitely don't want to do that. Okay. So so the title of this is Economics, Altruists, and Giving. And basically what I'm going to tell you about is a little bit about how economists think about charitable giving, why we think it's important, and a little bit about, sort of along the lines of what Liz did, I'm telling you about what some of the personal benefits from charitable giving are and what they look like inside the brain. So it's a combination of economics and maybe a little bit of neuroscience. So before I start talking about the charitable giving part of this, I want to sort of make a pitch for mainstream economics. And we ought to keep in mind when we start thinking about altruistic behavior, compassionate behavior, these things are very important. But it's also true that if we set up economic systems correctly, there are a lot of cases in which we don't really have to worry or don't have to rely on the compassion and altruism of people in order to get the job done, in order to provide the things that society needs. And so economists think a lot, the basic insight of economists really, is that we can often rely on people's self-interest to make society function. And so it's pretty simple. We set up the rules so that people can sell what they produce. If they harm other people, they have to compensate those people somehow. And in that market situation, prices provide information to people about what they should produce, what they should buy, what they shouldn't buy, and prices also provide incentives for people to try to produce the things that people value. So that's, in a lot of ways, a pretty good system. It's got some buts to it, though. And the biggest one of those is that sometimes, the costs of your actions spill over and affect other people. So economists think a lot about that, and we call that an externality, when what you do has harmful effects on other people. Another case that we worry about a lot as economists is that there's some very important things that simply can't be produced without helping other people inadvertently, which seems like a strange thing to be a problem, but to economists, that's a problem. So we have a whole class of goods as economists that we call public goods. And those are goods that benefit other people even if those other people didn't pay to provide the good. And you can see why in a market economy that's a problem, because if you can't charge people for the benefits they're getting, then other people are not going to supply those kinds of goods. Okay? So that's one of the classic problems of a market economy, is not enough of these kinds of goods. Now, there are lots of examples of public goods. The one I want to focus on is the well-being of poor people, because it's a simple case, and it's a case where charitable giving really matters, I think. So the economic explanation of this is really simple. Most people care about the welfare of poor people, but the welfare of poor people is a public good. And by that I mean that as the well-being of poor people increases, everyone who cares about the well-being of poor people is made better off. Okay? So the benefits of an improvement in the well-being of the poorest people in a society help everyone in the society, even the people who did nothing to help improve the lot of the poorest people in society. So that's a classic case of a public good. Given that that well-being is going to come to me whether I contribute to help poor people or not, I've got, in a market economy, not very much incentive to help provide that good. Okay? And society's got to provide it somehow. So what can we do about that? Well, we can rely on charity to provide the public good, or we can rely on some sort of taxation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both those different mechanisms for providing public goods and show you a little bit of evidence of this. Here's a little bit of data just to get started. In the United States, charitable giving is sort of rampant. 68% of families give something, and they give a lot. They give on average about 2% of their income. This varies a lot, though, from country to country. In the United Kingdom, people give less than 1% of their income away. In France, less than 0.1% of their income. I'm an American, so I have no idea what the number is for Canada, of course. Within the United States, charitable giving varies a lot also. So we should say that there's this variation across countries. There's also a lot of variation within the country. So the poorest people in the United States actually give, there's some evidence, this is a little controversial, but there's evidence that they give a higher percentage of their income than middle income people do. They give about 5% away. Middle income people give about 1%, and the richest people in the United States give, the rate of giving starts going up in percentage terms. They're giving 3% or so. Giving also increases with age, and it increases with income. So in some ways, this charitable giving, it's not really mysterious, right? We see some patterns in it, but we also see a lot of variation in it. So if you go back, 68% of families are giving something. A lot of them are giving nothing. What is the source of these kinds of variation? So in this paper, we're going to talk, the talk I'll give you, I'll give you an attempt to explain some of the variation in charitable giving, okay? And we're going to do that using an experiment. It's a very simple experiment. It's along the lines of what Liz was talking about. A dictator game, essentially. Only the recipient, instead of being a student, the recipient is a charitable organization. So what we do, we give people $100, and we tell them, you can either keep this money, or you can give some of it to a food bank. And the food bank, we explain that the food bank is an organization. It's actually a local food bank that gives food to low-income people in the community. We show them a blurb about it. They understand where the money's going. We make it clear that the money really will go there. We have a bunch of checks in there for something like that. So it's a pretty simple experiment, but there are a few little twists in it. So one of the twists is that we vary the price of giving. So sometimes it's very cheap to give money away in this experiment. for $15, you can give $45 to the food bank. Okay? So that's sort of like a tax deduction, or if somebody matches your contribution, right? You give a certain amount, they're going to match it for you. Essentially, that makes your donation cheaper in terms of its impact. Other times, though, we make it more expensive to give money to the charity. So we set it up so that you give $45 away, and that only turns into $15 for the food bank. So this is really just variation in the price of charitable giving. And when we do that, we can estimate what's essentially a supply function, or a demand function, you might think of it, for charitable giving. And so on the horizontal axis there, we've just got how much it costs. We got the price of charitable giving, essentially. How much it costs to give away $1. And on the vertical axis, we have how frequently people will make the charitable contribution. And it's, you know, a nice, simple, easy to understand, intuitive picture there. As it gets more expensive to make gifts, to make charitable gifts, people give less. It's just like the demand for any kind of good would be, right? Food, shoes, clothing, anything like that. Of course, as it gets more expensive, people don't buy as much. And with charitable giving, as it gets more expensive, they don't give as much money away either. Okay? So what I'm trying to show here is that while we sort of think of charitable giving as being a mysterious phenomenon that would be outside the bounds of rational explanation, I don't think that's true in some sense. A lot of it can be explained using very straightforward economic variables like price. Okay? But on the other hand, we also find that, you know, there is something sort of mysterious about charitable giving. Why would people give anything away in this experiment, right? It's purely altruistic. And so we want to try to understand the motives for making these charitable giving gifts in the first place. Yeah, the levels change with the price. But why do they do it in the first place? And so the way we do that in our experiment is we've got another treatment where we just tax people. There's no choice involved. Okay? We just tell them, you're going to give $30 of your money to the food bank. End of the story. And the catch is, while we're doing that, we have them in an fMRI brain scanner, and we can actually get an image of what's going on inside their brain as we're taxing them. Okay? This isn't the part where you're supposed to laugh. All right. So this is a picture of somebody's brain on taxes, essentially. And what you're seeing there is activation in an evolutionarily ancient part of the brain. It's called the nucleus accumbens, or the striatum. And it's an area that has been shown in animals to be very closely tied to rewards such as food and, I'll say it for Victor, sex. This area activates when animals experience those things, it activates when people think about those things. It's been shown by other economists that it activates when people get money. That makes sense, right? Money can buy you lots of pleasurable things, so it makes sense that the part of the brain that deals with pleasure would activate when you get money. And we find that in this, actually those are the yellow areas of this diagram. Those are the areas that are activating when the person gets money for themselves. But we also show is that we show these blue areas, and those are the parts of the brain that activate when we tax the person, take their money away, and use it to give to the food bank. Okay, and those are very, you can see there's a lot of overlap. The green is areas that are overlap that activate in both conditions. So what we're showing here is that the same parts of the brain that deal with money for yourselves, that activate when you get a reward for yourself, also activate when you see money going to a charitable cause that's going to help other people. And that's an explanation for why we see charitable giving, because it buys people a neural reward inside their brain that's very similar to the reward they get from buying anything else. Okay? So of course they do it. It makes them feel good. And we can actually see evidence of that happening inside the brain. But we can actually, you know, you sort of might think, okay, their brains are lighting up. What does that really tell you? Well, one thing that we can do is actually correlate the activation in their brain with their propensity to make charitable gifts in the voluntary part of the experiment, the part that I started with when I was talking about the dictator game. So in this diagram, on the horizontal axis, we've got how much more their brain activates when they see the money go to the food bank. How much more it activates in that condition than when they get money to for themselves. So the people on the right hand of this are people who, in the tax situation, are showing a lot of brain activation when they're taxed to provide the public good, for the money for the food bank. On the left-hand side are the people whose brains don't activate very much when they see money go to the food bank. Their brains activate a lot, though, when they get money for themselves. Okay? On the vertical axis is in the voluntary part, the charitable giving part of the experiment, how frequently they make gifts. And sure enough, there's a link, a correlation between the brain activation in the tax treatments and the charitable giving in the voluntary treatments. Okay? So, I've got about 5 more minutes or so. Sure. So, what we've got here is evidence for what economists would call pure altruism. That when you make a charitable gift that helps other people, okay, your brain is activating because of the fact that those people have been made better off. So there's a sort of simple story about this now from the economic point of view. We think about self-interest in market economies. Works for some things, but it's going to mean not enough public goods. But now we have this neural evidence that shows that people actually are altruistic, that they get some reward from that altruism. And we sort of think, great, this is a solution to the problem of public goods. But it's not, okay? And this is the part of the talk that gets a little philosophical. It doesn't solve the problem because this is pure altruism. And this is an altruism that comes from seeing the well-being of poor people increased, improved, okay? When the money goes to the food bank, you know there's more food, you feel better. The problem is that with many people, this purely altruistic motive gets very quickly diluted by the numbers of people. So you think, okay, that's great, but why should I give the money to make those people better off when everyone else in the room is going to also share the benefits? So while this pure altruism motive sounds great, it's pure after all, it can't get much better than that, it doesn't lead to much charitable giving because people tend to free ride on the contributions of others in a society. It'll work in a small group where there are only a couple people, and if you don't do something to help, nobody else will, nothing will happen. But in a large group, you have this tendency to rely on what others do. Okay? So the implication so far is that people should not be making gifts in large groups, even though they're purely altruistic. And that's a problem. It's the worst kind of problem for an economist because it's not true. Okay? People actually do make charitable gifts, and that's what we started with, showing that 68% of families are making charitable gifts, and they're making pretty large ones. So there's obviously something wrong with our story. Our story says that purely altruistic people shouldn't make charitable gifts, but we see lots of charitable gifts. And so we need to try to explain that a little bit also. And the economic explanation for what's going on there is going to be that instead of just having a purely altruistic motive for making charitable gifts, people also have a more selfish, warm glow motive for making charitable gifts. And that's a little different than the purely altruistic motive. You only get the warm glow benefit if you have made the gift yourself to improve the level of the public good, to improve the well-being of other people. In the purely altruistic motive, if the problem's solved, you feel better. In the warm glow situation, you only feel better if you have done something to help solve the problem. Okay? And we're also able to show evidence of that in the same sorts of areas of the brain by showing that the reward area activations are higher in the conditions where people make the charitable gifts voluntarily instead of having them be made for them in the form of taxation. Okay? So the sort of takeaway from this story is that even the simple kind of altruism that interests economists, gifts to provide public goods like this, has very complex causes. It has very wide variation across people. And paradoxically, what philosophically sounds like the most praiseworthy, credible form of altruism is the least likely to actually lead to charitable giving. And instead, if we want to really get the money to improve these social problems, we need to rely on the warm glow motives, the motive of telling people that you need to do something to help solve this problem yourself personally, or else you're not going to get the benefits that accrue to you in the form of charitable giving. Okay? So that's the basis for the warm glow motive for charitable giving here. And then the last thing I'll just say is that keep in mind that economic systems provide many things without altruism by relying on this price mechanism, but it's clear that public goods will be underprovided, and in that situation we're going to need some sort of altruism to provide these things. And I'd say the takeaway is either we cultivate this warm glow form of altruism, or we're going to be relying on taxes to provide the public goods. Takeaway.